This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 269, A 7% Solution. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to get all hopped up today?
I'm ready to do a little skipping. I'm ready to do a little jumping. I'm ready to do a little jump rope. And if it would make you happy, I'll hop too.
Oh, that's so good. Well, you looked a little down there. I wanted to kind of lift you out of the doldrums and give you a little jolt.
We haven't lived in the doldrums for 15 years. You know, and when I lived in Doldrums, New Jersey, I loved it because it was very somnambulant. And at one point I wanted to become mayor, but it turns out that it's the only district in New Jersey with a well-established, long-serving communist local political government. And so, you know, I just didn't want to share my yawns with anybody.
Well, perfect. Well, you know the national anthem of Doldrums, at least when you describe it, is the old rim shot. Everybody's favorite use of the drums, the Dole drums. Okay, so if you would like the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles269. All lowercase will get you there to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site. There's an opportunity to look through the notes there. Click on the link for the article from History Today that inspired this. This article, by the way, was sent in by Charlie Blankstein, our longtime friend and supporter, and Charlie inspired this episode. And it's funny because we both looked at each other over email and said, have we ever done anything on cocaine on Trifles? And we only glanced by it in episode 84 when we talked about Holmes's neat Morocco case that was on his mantelpiece. That was part of the series that we did of things inside 221B Baker Street. But we never covered Holmes's drug habit. So this is an opportunity for us to take part in that and to help everybody else understand what it is that that Victorians thought of drug use in the late 19th century. Before we do go down that road, I should mention that later in the show we have a drawing where every one of our patrons is eligible. And again, to be a patron, it's as little as $1 a month, but you can put in as much as you want. And you will be eligible for a drawing every month for some back issues of the Baker Street Journal. In addition, our patrons are also eligible for a quarterly drawing. And the quarterly drawings, there are 4 of them, as you would intimate, are for free subscriptions to the Baker Street Journal. So it's a lovely opportunity to support us simply by going to the show notes or to our homepage at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and become a patron. So, Bert, we mentioned that we've never talked about cocaine in depth before. And this is fascinating because, yes, we'll touch a little bit on Holmes's use of cocaine, but I think this is more of an opportunity for us to look at what was the norm at the time and what was the history of cocaine. And Charlie sent in this article that really helps to frame it for us. So I will tee it up from there and let you Run with it. Just inject us with some cocaine knowledge.
When Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1930, one newspaper wrote, Sherlock Holmes was a man who took cocaine before cocaine was fashionable. But why is it that Conan Doyle lighted on cocaine specifically as Holmes' drug of choice? And why were the Victorian public, at least at first, so ready to embrace both Holmes and his, 7% solution? Well, it's interesting in that the cocaine alkaloid had been isolated and extracted as early as the 1850s, but it was not widely known until 1884. And that was the year that an ophthalmologist, and isn't that interesting because we know that Conan Doyle studied ophthalmology with the objective of becoming an eye surgeon at one point, remarkably unsuccessfully, which we thank those patients who stayed away from his practice. But it was a ophthalmologist in Vienna who discovered that a mild solution of cocaine could act as a local anesthetic. And this was a big deal because in the 1880s, something that could take away the pain of surgery but keep the user awake was like a miracle because you had general anesthetics like chloroform, but nowhere near the precision through which anesthesia is delivered today. When you administered a complete knockout through chloroform, people were still worried, I might not wake up at the end of all of this. But cocaine allowed many smaller operations like dental surgeries or eye operations to be done without that risk of general anesthesia.
Now, I am just thinking rationally as someone who fears needles and sharp objects around my cranial area, what it must have been like for a patient who only had local anesthesia to see that blade or needle coming at the eye and having to be awake for it. Now, I suppose it is better than being chloroformed because not only, as you mentioned, was there a risk of not waking up, but I would imagine that under that kind of anesthesia, the natural tendency with relaxing the muscles is the eyes would roll back into the head, much like you do when you sleep. So for an ophthalmologist, that would have been extraordinarily difficult to attempt a surgery, unless it was at the bottom of the eyeball. If you're trying to go in and, handle cataracts or if there's been a retinal detachment or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it was the equivalent, right before the 19th century became the 20th century of a big technological breakthrough on the scale anyway, of decoding the human genome, of the double helix of DNA. And in fact, one of the presidents of the British Medical Association pronounced that, boy, a new era seems to have dawned. And cocaine, as a result, became a celebrity drug. And in places like Chambers Journal, you had stories, headlines after headline, stories like the latest cocaine miracle. And it really caught, the zeitgeist of the time. Chambers wrote, cocaine has flashed like a meteor before the eyes of the medical world, but unlike a meteor, its impressions have proved to be enduring. While it is destined in the future to occupy a high position in the estimation of those whom duty requires to combat the ravages of disease.
So it sounded like, at least for those in the know, the medical professionals, those following the journals, and certainly Conan Doyle at this point early on in his career would have been one of those, following the latest developments in ophthalmological practice. They thought there was a lot of promise here. Just as a side note, Vienna is an interesting connection for a couple of reasons. One, Conan Doyle did go to Vienna to study, and clearly it was an ophthalmological center within Europe. You had Weiss equipment manufacturer. They, of course, are the ones that made the cataract knives that we see pop up in Silver Blaze. And who else had his origin in Vienna? Sigmund Freud, the hero of Nick Meyer's The 7% Solution, where he made a study about cocaine and addiction. So all of these things in Vienna kind of pointing toward cocaine and eye treatment and eye surgery are just fascinating. And it stands to reason that Conan Doyle would have been kind of sucked into that vortex.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And it all happened at the same time that the kind of drug controls and legislation that we take for granted today were really unknown. And in fact, as you can tell, if this is something that became popular in the 1880s, largely within the medical community, the notion of addiction, the understanding of addiction, addictive diseases, was compared to today very primitive. Unlike the content you can find from our sponsors, which it might be reasonable to tell you about right now.
If you're a regular listener of Trifles, you'll know that we also have another show called I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And of course, we do hear of Sherlock everywhere around the globe, and it's partially due to the BSI Press. The BSI Press has been doing the international series for well over a decade, and it takes you to places that, well, you couldn't otherwise go without the BSI Press's help. And that is inside scholarship coming from Sherlockian societies from all corners of the globe. You'll find Japan and Sherlock Holmes, Scandinavia and Sherlock Holmes, Australia, Italy, Spain, Canada. The list continues to grow. So if you're interested in what people from all around the world have to say about Sherlock Holmes, find that common bond at the BSI Press website, BakerStreetIrregulars.com, and pick out an international volume of your choice today. It's the end of the month, and that means it's time to do our drawing from among our Patreon supporters for back issues of the Baker Street Journal, courtesy of our sponsors. So let's bring over all the names, reach in, and give the wheel a big spin. See what number comes up from all of our Patreon supporters. It is number 12, and that corresponds to Douglas Vaughn. Douglas, congratulations. We will be sharing your name and address with the Baker Street Journal, and you will receive some back issues of the BSJ. Thank you so much. And if anyone else would like to participate in this, we do this every month. And on the quarter, we have another drawing for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Just go to patreon.com/trifles or check the link in our show notes. All right, we're back, and we're talking about quacks on crack. I guess. That's the best I could do on short notice. Sorry.
Oh, I think that's pretty good. Sounds like a Daffy Duck cartoon.
Go ahead.
Yeah, to keep going with the sort of story here, and I think it's really kind of interesting. As we say, this looked to people in the Victorian age like a great boon, and so it became a home remedy. And it was also the early days of the Coca-Cola Company in Atlanta, Georgia. And, of course, the way Coca-Cola started was that it did have a small percentage. I can't remember. I think it maybe was 3%, 5% of cocaine in the original formulation that Pemberton
It wasn't 7%?
developed. No, I don't think so.
No.
It was relatively minor.
Yeah,
but
mild.
you found cocaine mixed into cures for seasickness, for cold medicine, for voice lozenges. And there was a homemade cold cure, a recipe published in 1896 that called for a mix of cocaine, ground coffee, menthol, and powdered sugar. And what you did was you inhaled this like snuff. You just sort of breathed it in.
Isn't that fascinating? Ultimately, in its more popular use, cocaine would become something that people snorted, much like snuff. So this could be where it had its origins. Interesting. Well, and it's kind of a mother's little helper here, a stimulant, something that has multiple purposes. That depending on what ails you, it is good for it.
Yeah. Now, one thing I didn't know until I sort of looked at the source that Charlie sent was that apparently in the late 19th century, there was a vogue among the smart set, the Victorian smart set, for tattoos. And this strikes me as so unusual. I mean, I can't think of a generation of people that were more covered up than the Victorians. So if I got my tattoo, how would I possibly communicate that good news to anyone? Anyway, the observation is that cocaine anesthesia, it was a great way to avoid the pain of the tattooist's needle. Now, what I like about that is that it gives me a really positive interpretation of the last few minutes of the 1939 20th Century Fox Hound of the Baskervilles, when in the original original edit, Basil Rathbone says to Nigel Bruce, "Oh, Watson, the needle." And clearly what Rathbone was interested in was to get probably a small image of a dog done, on his elbow, probably.
Well, this brings up a really interesting topic. I don't know that we've done an episode on tattoos. This will be a follow-up episode, I suppose.
Oh, good. How could we have avoided that since Holmes was such an expert?
Yeah, well, I'll do the research. If we have, I'll let people know. But if we haven't, boy, that's a rich opportunity. And I'm just going to break in here because I did a little research after we recorded this, and indeed we did do an episode on tattoos. It was in Season 4, August of 2020, episode 188. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. Now, back to your regularly scheduled program. So let's see if we can bring this back to Sherlock Holmes. So we've got this widespread interest in cocaine, this new drug. We've got Conan Doyle's interest and professional training in ophthalmology. So there's this parallel between creating a new detective, new literary genre, a new and up-and-coming drug, a spectacular-seeming discovery, a miracle drug. So you pair the miracle detective with the miracle drug, and voila. I mean, I suppose that's how it happened. So Holmes is often depicted as being completely up to date in terms of his methodologies and his understandings. And in some cases, he is actually ahead of the curve. He is out in front and, telling Lestrade and others to look up his monographs on, the tracing of footprints or on fingerprints or, on and on. So it stands to reason that Holmes would also be on the cutting edge of cocaine.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because we tend to think of Holmes as locked into conservative and perhaps not necessarily the world's most innovative era or generation. But he was, a modern and technologically innovative detective. And this was a modern drug. And then, of course, as the risks in the early 20th century became known, addiction and toxicity. So by 1904, in The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter, we say goodbye to cocaine, and Holmes must make do for the rest of his career with shag tobacco and black coffee.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the mentions of cocaine in the canon, they really only span 5 stories, starting with The Sign of Four, quickly on the heels of that with A Scandal in Bohemia, and then The 5 Orange Pips, and then The Man with the Twisted Lip and the Yellow Face. And then, as you say, by the time we get to The Return, that's it for Holmes and his addiction. And it's even hinted at in A Study in Scarlet, where he says he gets down in the dumps at times, but if Watson leaves him alone, he'll soon be right. But it wasn't until that second story in The Sign of Four that Watson talked about Holmes doing the drug many times, 3 times a day for as many months, I think. So the sensibilities had come around by the turn of the century, and so too had Conan Doyle.
Mm. And that is just a trifle.
What things? It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What is it tonight? Morphine? Or cocaine?
Well, I can strongly recommend a 7% solution of cocaine. Would you care to try?